just in reparation payments approved, $151 million for each Black American to close the wealth gap.
Centuries of systemic racism have created a wealth gap in America between Black and white Americans. In her latest New York Times piece, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Nikole Hannah-Jones writes, if true justice and equality are ever to be achieved in the United States, the country must finally take seriously what it owes Black Americans. MSNBC correspondent Tremaine Lee interviewed Nikole Hannah-Jones in his latest Into America podcast on reparations. Tremaine joins me now. And Tremaine, what are the factors that Nikole talked about here that are contributing or have contributed to the racial wealth gap in our country?
Hey, Allison, more than just contributions, the actual source, the root of the wealth gap goes back to shortly after emancipation, when the entire, enslaved population, formerly enslaved population, really were pushed out with absolutely nothing, starting from ground zero. And even though the government had promised some restitution in 40 acres and a mule, those promises fell through. And in fact, the former, plantation owners were given back that land that had been promised to enslaved people. But then after that, decades and decades of Jim Crow laws, lack of access to jobs, depressed housing values, on and on, up from after emancipation through Reconstruction, Redemption, into the 50s and 60s. All of these contributing factors, including the actual violent dispossession of wealth, the actual bombing of Black Wall Street, the actual burning and looting of Black communities all across the country. And that land and that wealth and resources were never returned.
So how do we begin to close the gap between Black and white Americans, and what would closing that gap mean for Black Americans, their future, their economic security?
Well, part of the issue has always been that Black folks haven't been able to accumulate the wealth and then pass it on, like buying a house and then passing it on to your children, or taking the equity out of that and passing it on. And so Nikole Hannah-Jones argues that there is only one solution, and that's restitution or reparations. Let's take a listen to what she has to say.
Imagine this. Tomorrow morning, the United States announces that every Black American is entitled to $151 million in reparations. Not just a symbolic gesture, but actual life-changing wealth, deposited directly into the hands of those whose ancestors built this country for free. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, by the end of this video, you'll not only understand why this is entirely possible, but also why every Black American should never pay taxes again. Yes, you heard that right. Never pay taxes again. Stay with me, because the numbers, the history, and the moral argument are all on our side. Let's start with a simple yet powerful question. What if reparations were the key to solving the racial wealth gap once and for all? Right now, the median wealth of a white family in America is nearly 8 times higher than that of a Black family. 8 times. That's not a gap, that's a canyon. And this disparity didn't happen by accident. It's the result of centuries of systemic exploitation, starting with slavery and continuing through Jim Crow laws, redlining, and discriminatory practices that persist to this day. But what if we could change that narrative? What if we could give every Black American the financial freedom they deserve? Hello and welcome to the Chronicles of Blacks, a channel where we delve into the deep tapestry of Black history. Please subscribe to our channel as we continue our fight for justice as Blacks. Here's the shocking truth. Reparations aren't just a moral obligation, they're a financial necessity. Let me break it down for you. The total economic value of the labor stolen during slavery is estimated to be around $6.2 trillion in today's dollars. That's not even accounting for the generational wealth that was stolen through segregation, discriminatory lending practices, and economic disenfranchisement. Reparations could close the racial wealth gap overnight, but more importantly, they would finally begin to address the economic harm inflicted on Black Americans for generations. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why reparations of this magnitude could mean that Black Americans should never have to pay another cent in taxes. Think about it. If the government owes you $151 million, how could they possibly justify taxing you on top of that? The numbers don't lie, and the math is simple. What Black Americans are owed far exceeds any amount they've paid in taxes or will ever pay in their lifetimes. But before we dive into the tax implications, let's talk about why this issue is so urgent. Did you know that during the Jim Crow era, Black Americans were deliberately excluded from programs like the GI Bill, which helped millions of white families buy homes, start businesses, and build generational wealth? or that black farmers lost an estimated 90% of their land due to discriminatory lending and outright theft. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated system designed to keep black Americans economically disadvantaged. Here's a quick example. Redlining, the practice of denying loans to black families based on where they lived, didn't just block access to homeownership, it robbed entire communities of the opportunity to build wealth. And the effects are still felt today. Black families are far less likely to own homes, which means they miss out on one of the most significant sources of generational wealth in America. And yet, despite all of this, black Americans have contributed billions in taxes, funding a system that has historically worked against them. This is why reparations aren't just about writing a check, they're about justice. They're about finally acknowledging that the economic inequality we see today is a direct result of policies that were designed to oppress. And they're about leveling the playing field so that every black American has the opportunity to thrive. Imagine the possibilities. $151 million in reparations could mean financial freedom for millions of families. It could mean homeownership, education, entrepreneurship, and the ability to invest in future generations. And yes, it could mean no longer paying taxes to a system that has failed to deliver on its promises of equality and opportunity. So here's what I want you to think about as we move forward. If the US government can find trillions of dollars to fund wars, bail out corporations, and give tax cuts to billionaires, why can't it find the money to repay the debt it owes to black Americans? And more importantly, how can we make sure that this conversation doesn't just stay hypothetical, but becomes a reality? By the end of this video, you'll have the answers to these questions and more. You'll understand not just why reparations are necessary, but how they could reshape America forever. And you'll see why, after everything black Americans have endured, paying taxes should be off the table until the debt is paid in full. Stick around, this is just the beginning. The case for reparations isn't just about righting historical wrongs. It's about addressing a financial imbalance that black Americans have been forced to carry for generations. But here's the twist. Reparations don't just level the playing field. They make the case that black Americans should be exempt from taxes altogether. Let's break it down. First, let's talk about the tax burden that black Americans shoulder. Right now, black households contribute billions of dollars annually to federal, state, and local taxes. According to recent studies, black taxpayers contribute 13.8% of all federal income taxes, despite earning far less than their white counterparts. Think about that for a moment. A population that has been historically excluded from wealth-building opportunities is disproportionately funding a system that has worked against them for centuries. Now, let's look at this through the lens of reparations. If each black American were entitled to $151 million in reparations, the government would effectively owe them far more than they've ever paid, or will ever pay in taxes. Let's say a typical black household pays around $10,000 in federal and state taxes annually. Over a lifetime, that might add up to $400,000 to $500,000 in taxes, still a drop in the bucket compared to the $151 million owed in reparations. The numbers make it clear, black Americans are not just taxpayers, they're creditors. And the debt owed to them isn't hypothetical, it's real, quantifiable, and long overdue. But the argument goes deeper than just the numbers. Taxes are supposed to fund services and systems that benefit the people who pay them. For centuries, however, black Americans have been taxed to fund systems that actively excluded or oppressed them. Let's take a historical example. During the Jim Crow era, black Americans were required to pay taxes just like everyone else, yet they were denied access to the very schools, hospitals, and public services their taxes funded. In fact, much of the infrastructure in the South was built with tax dollars from black citizens who were barred from using those same facilities. This isn't just inequality, it's theft. And it didn't end with Jim Crow. Even today, black Americans face systemic barriers that diminish the value of their tax contributions. Consider property taxes, which fund public schools. Because of redlining and segregation, black families are more likely to live in areas with lower property values, resulting in underfunded schools. This creates a cycle where black children are systematically denied the same educational opportunities as their white peers, despite their families paying the same, or higher, tax rates in some cases. Then there's the issue of criminal justice. Black Americans are disproportionately taxed to fund police departments, courts, and prisons, all while being over-policed, over-prosecuted, and over-incarcerated. For example, in Ferguson, Missouri, over 20% of the city's budget came from fines and court fees, disproportionately levied on black residents. Essentially, black Americans are paying for a system that criminalizes their very existence. Now, let's circle back to reparations. If the government acknowledges its debt to black Americans, debt that stems from centuries of exploitation, exclusion, and systemic racism, how can it continue to justify taxing them? Here's a question to consider. If America can afford to give massive tax cuts to billionaires and corporations, why can't it afford to stop taxing black Americans who are owed reparations? The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act alone cost the U.S. government over $1.5 trillion in lost revenue, most of which benefited the wealthiest Americans. Compare that to the estimated $10 to $12 trillion cost of reparations. The math is simple, the resources exist, they're just a matter of priorities. Finally, let's talk about fairness. Some might argue that exempting black Americans from taxes is unfair to other groups. But let's be clear, fairness isn't about treating everyone the same, it's about addressing the inequities that have been baked into the system. Reparations and tax exemptions are not special treatment, they're overdue justice. So here's the bottom line. Black Americans have been forced to pay into a system that has exploited and excluded them for centuries. Reparations are not just a way to balance the scales, they're a way to acknowledge the truth and begin to repair the damage. And until that debt is paid in full, asking black Americans to pay taxes is nothing short of adding insult to injury. The numbers don't lie. The history doesn't lie. Reparations aren't just necessary, they're a moral and financial imperative. And if the government is serious about justice, it must recognize that black Americans shouldn't be footing the bill for a system that still owes them so much. To truly understand why reparations are not only justified but essential, we need to revisit one of the most damaging periods in American history, the Jim Crow era. This was a time when laws weren't just racist in their intent, they were economic weapons designed to keep black Americans in a permanent state of poverty. These laws didn't just strip away opportunities, they actively stole wealth from black communities, and their impact is still felt today. Let's break it down. During the Jim Crow era, black Americans were systematically denied access to the basic building blocks of economic success. Take land ownership, for example. Land is one of the most reliable ways to build generational wealth, but for black Americans, owning land was often a near impossible dream. By the early 20th century, black farmers owned over 16 million acres of land. But through a combination of discriminatory lending practices, legal loopholes, and outright violence, black land ownership dwindled to less than 2 million acres by the end of the century. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a coordinated effort to strip black Americans of their wealth. Then there was housing. The Federal Housing Administration, established in the 1930s, was supposed to make homeownership accessible to more Americans. But through a process known as redlining, the FHA refused to insure mortgages in predominantly black neighborhoods. This meant that black families couldn't access the low-interest loans that allowed millions of white families to buy homes and build wealth. Even worse, black families who managed to buy homes often saw their property values deliberately devalued because of the color of their skin. Over decades, this cost black families an estimated $156 billion in lost equity, money that should have been passed down to future generations. Education was another area where Jim Crow laws inflicted lasting economic harm. Black schools were chronically underfunded, receiving only a fraction of the resources allocated to white schools. This wasn't just a matter of neglect, it was a deliberate strategy to deny black children the education they needed to compete in the workforce. Even when black families paid taxes to support public education, those dollars were funneled into schools that excluded their children. The result? Generations of black Americans were locked out of higher-paying jobs and career opportunities. But the economic oppression didn't stop with education. After World War II, programs like the GI Bill helped millions of veterans buy homes, start businesses, and attend college. But black veterans were largely excluded from these benefits. Southern officials ensured that black soldiers returning from war were denied access to the programs they had fought to earn. This robbed black families of the chance to use these benefits to build wealth, while white families used them to catapult into the middle class. Even black entrepreneurs faced systemic barriers. Many cities had laws that restricted black-owned businesses from operating in certain areas, effectively cutting them off from lucrative markets. In cases where black businesses thrived despite these obstacles, they were often targeted for destruction. One of the most infamous examples is the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where a thriving black community known as Black Wall Street was destroyed by a white mob. In a single night, hundreds of lives were lost, and an estimated $200 million in today's dollars was wiped out. And let's not forget the role of the criminal justice system. During the Jim Crow era, black Americans were disproportionately arrested and convicted for minor or fabricated offenses, then sentenced to hard labor in prison camps. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about profit. The convict leasing system allowed states to lease incarcerated black men to private companies, essentially continuing the practice of slavery under a different name. This forced labor not only denied black men their freedom, but also deprived their families of breadwinners and economic stability. These injustices weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic effort to maintain white supremacy by keeping black Americans economically disadvantaged. And while the Jim Crow era officially ended with the civil rights movement, its legacy lives on. Today, black Americans still face significant barriers to wealth building, from discriminatory lending practices to wage gaps and employment discrimination. The racial wealth gap we see today isn't a fluke, it's the direct result of policies designed to create and maintain inequality. Now, let's talk about the modern-day parallels. While Jim Crow laws are no longer on the books, their impact is still evident in the policies and practices that continue to disadvantage black Americans. For example, predatory lending disproportionately targets black borrowers, charging them higher interest rates and fees than their white counterparts, even when they have similar credit profiles. This has resulted in black families losing billions of dollars in wealth through foreclosures and excessive interest payments. Wage inequality is another area where the legacy of Jim Crow persists. On average, black workers earn about 75 cents for every dollar earned by white workers, and the gap is even wider for black women. This disparity isn't just about individual paychecks, it's about a lifetime of lost earnings, reduced retirement savings, and diminished opportunities for future generations. Even in the realm of taxation, the disparities are glaring. Black Americans are more likely to face audits and penalties from the IRS, despite earning less than white taxpayers. In some states, black homeowners pay higher property taxes than white homeowners in similar neighborhoods. This means that black families are not only earning less, but also paying more into a system that continues to work against them. So, what does all this mean for reparations? It means that the debt owed to black Americans isn't just about slavery, it's about the cumulative impact of centuries of systemic oppression, from Jim Crow to modern-day discrimination. Reparations aren't just about making up for the past, they're about addressing the present. They're about acknowledging that the economic harm inflicted on black Americans didn't end with slavery, it evolved, and it's still happening today. This is why reparations must be comprehensive. They can't just be a one-time payment. They must include structural changes to address the systemic inequalities that persist. And they must recognize that the economic debt owed to black Americans far outweighs any taxes they've ever paid. Until this debt is paid in full, asking black Americans to contribute to a system that has historically excluded them isn't just unjust, it's immoral. The bottom line is this: the legacy of Jim Crow isn't just history, it's an ongoing reality. Reparations are about more than money, they're about justice. They're about repairing the harm that's been done and creating a future where black Americans can finally build the wealth and opportunities they've been denied for far too long. It's time for America to face this truth and take action. The conversation about reparations isn't just about acknowledging the past, it's about taking bold steps to correct centuries of systemic injustice. But beyond the moral argument lies a practical one. Reparations aren't just the right thing to do, they're the smart thing to do. By addressing the racial wealth gap, America has the chance to not only repair its past, but also build a stronger, more equitable future. Let's unpack the case for reparations and why they must come with a tax exemption for black Americans. First, the moral argument is undeniable. For centuries, black Americans have been exploited, excluded, and oppressed, yet they've continued to contribute to the economic growth of this country. From unpaid labor during slavery to paying taxes into systems that excluded them, black Americans have given far more to this nation than they've received in return. Reparations aren't charity, they're justice. They acknowledge that the wealth and power of the United States were built, in large part, on the backs of enslaved Africans and their descendants. But morality alone isn't enough to create change, so let's talk about the economic argument. Reparations, if done correctly, would inject trillions of dollars into the economy, benefiting not just black Americans but the nation as a whole. Imagine millions of black families suddenly having the resources to buy homes, start businesses, and invest in education. The ripple effects would be transformative. Studies show that reducing the racial wealth gap would significantly boost the GDP, create jobs, and stimulate economic growth. In short, reparations aren't just good for Black Americans, they're good for America. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: taxes. If the government recognizes that it owes Black Americans $151 million each in reparations, how can it justify continuing to tax them? The logic is clear: until the debt is paid in full, Black Americans shouldn't have to contribute to a system that has historically worked against them. This isn't just about fairness, it's about accountability. By exempting Black Americans from taxes, the government acknowledges that the financial contributions of Black citizens have already exceeded their fair share. It's a tangible way to begin repairing the economic harm caused by centuries of systemic racism. Think about what this would mean for Black families. The average American pays about 30% of their income in taxes. For Black Americans, eliminating that tax burden would free up billions of dollars annually. That money could be reinvested into Black-owned businesses, used to pay off debt, or saved for future generations. In essence, a tax exemption isn't just about financial relief, it's about empowerment. It's about giving Black Americans the resources to build wealth on their own terms. And let's not forget the historical context. For centuries, Black Americans have been forced to pay into systems that excluded or actively harmed them. During the Jim Crow era, Black taxpayers funded schools, hospitals, and public infrastructure that they were barred from using. Even today, Black communities are disproportionately taxed through practices like predatory fines and fees, all while receiving fewer resources in return. A tax exemption acknowledges this history and begins to level the playing field. But beyond the economic and moral arguments lies a bigger question: what kind of country do we want to be? Reparations and tax exemptions aren't just about righting past wrongs. They're about building a future where justice and equality are more than just ideals. They're about creating a society where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of their race or background. And they're about showing the world that America is willing to confront its past to create a better future. Here's the bottom line: reparations are about more than money. They're about acknowledging the truth, repairing the harm, and creating a future where Black Americans can finally thrive. And a tax exemption isn't just a financial benefit, it's a statement. It says, we see the harm that's been done, and we're committed to making it right. Now, it's up to us to keep this conversation going. Reparations and tax exemptions won't happen overnight, but change starts with awareness and action. So if this video resonated with you, here's what you can do: share this video with your friends and family. Start conversations about reparations and why they matter. And most importantly, let your voice be heard. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the Chronicles of Blacks for more deep dives into issues that matter. Together, we can create the awareness needed to push for change. Thanks for watching, and let's keep the conversation alive. To repay that debt isn't just morally right, it's a matter of national integrity. Logic doesn't hold. If you owe someone money, you don't turn around and demand that they pay you more. Instead, you settle the debt. Exempting Black Americans from taxes until reparations are paid isn't just a financial argument, it's a moral one. It acknowledges that the contributions of Black Americans to this country have already far exceeded their fair share. From the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans that built America's wealth, to the taxes they've paid into systems that excluded them, Black Americans have more than earned their right to tax relief. And let's not forget the broader economic impact. Eliminating the tax burden for Black Americans, even temporarily, would free up billions of dollars annually that could be reinvested into Black communities. This money could fund Black-owned businesses, support educational opportunities, and help close the racial wealth gap. In essence, it's not just about giving back what's owed, it's about creating a foundation for future growth and prosperity. What if I told you that in 1865, right after the Civil War, every freed African American actually received the 40 acres and a mule they were promised? How would that single decision have changed the course of history? Would Black communities today be at the center of America's wealth and innovation? Would systemic racism and generational poverty even exist? This isn't just a hypothetical, it's a glimpse into an alternate reality that could have reshaped America forever. And in this video, we're diving deep into what the world might look like if reparations were actually paid. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you won't look at history, or the present, the same way again. Ask if you're new here. Welcome to the Chronicles of Black's channel where we explore untold stories, alternate histories, and the hidden truths of Black history and culture. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios in American history. What if reparations were paid to freed African Americans in 1865? Now, let's set the stage. After the Civil War ended, millions of African Americans were freed from slavery, but with no resources, no land, and no real support. Then came the promise: 40 acres and a mule, a chance to rebuild lives and create generational wealth. It was a glimmer of hope for a brighter future. But that promise? It was broken. The land was taken back, leaving freed slaves to fend for themselves in a system designed to keep them at the bottom. So, what if that promise was fulfilled? What if African Americans had been given the land and resources they deserved? How different would America look today? In this video, we're going to unpack the historical facts, crunch the numbers, and imagine the ripple effects of a world where reparations were paid, and I promise, the picture we'll paint will leave you speechless. Asterisk. Let's take a step back to 1865. The Civil War had just ended, slavery was abolished, and over 4 million African Americans were finally free. But freedom didn't mean opportunity. Most were left with nothing: no land, no money, no tools, in a country that had actively profited from their unpaid labor for centuries. Then came Special Field Order No. 15, issued by Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. This was the origin of the famous promise: 40 acres and a mule for every freed family. The idea was simple: give them the land they had worked on for generations so they could build a new life. And for a brief moment, it actually started happening. Families were given plots of land along the coast in places like Georgia and South Carolina. Imagine the hope that must have sparked. But just months later, President Andrew Johnson reversed the order. The land was taken back and handed right back to former Confederate landowners. That broken promise marked a pivotal moment. Instead of building wealth and stability, freed African Americans were thrust into a system of sharecropping and exploitation that kept them trapped in poverty for generations. But here's the question we're asking today: what if Johnson hadn't reversed the order? What if reparations had been delivered as promised? What kind of ripple effect would that have had, not just for Black Americans, but for the entire country? Asterisk. Now, let's break this down and imagine what could have been if reparations were paid in 1865. Hello dear viewers, we noticed from our analytics that we are having an international community of viewers. Please tell us where you are watching from in the comments section below. At the time, there were around 4 million freed African Americans. If each family received 40 acres of land, that would total over 160 million acres. To put that into perspective, that's nearly the size of California. Today, that land would be worth billions, possibly trillions, in generational wealth. But the real power of land ownership isn't just in the land itself, it's in what you can do with it. Imagine millions of Black families owning fertile farmland, starting businesses, and passing down wealth to their children. This would have created a foundation for thriving communities, economic hubs like Black Wall Street, but on a much larger scale and decades earlier. With land comes opportunity, the ability to secure loans, fund education, and build businesses. Instead of being systematically excluded from wealth-building opportunities like the Homestead Act or the GI Bill, Black Americans could have been leading the charge in shaping the modern U.S. economy. The racial wealth gap we see today, it might never have existed. Black-owned banks, universities, and corporations could have been among the most powerful institutions in America, helping to shape policies and drive innovation. And it's not just about individual wealth. Thriving Black communities would have contributed massively to the national economy, creating jobs, innovation, and cultural influence on a scale we can only imagine. So, ask yourself this: how different would America look today if Black Americans had been given the resources they were promised 160 years ago? The possibilities are staggering. Asterisk. The economic impact alone would have been massive, but what about the social and cultural implications? Let's dig deeper. If reparations had been paid in 1865, the ripple effect on American society would have been profound. Think about it. Land ownership and generational wealth would have allowed Black families to build strong, self-sufficient communities. Schools, churches, and businesses could have been established without the constant threat of economic displacement or systemic oppression. Now imagine the social standing of African Americans in a world where wealth and influence were built over generations. Would segregation have taken hold the way it did? Would Jim Crow laws have been so effective if black communities had the resources to fight back legally, politically, and economically? Consider this: movements like the Harlem Renaissance, the Civil Rights Movement, and even the cultural dominance we see today in music, art, and sports, all of these might have been amplified. Black Americans wouldn't have just been surviving, they would have been thriving, creating even greater cultural, political, and economic contributions. And what about the perception of race itself? In a country where black wealth and power were normalized from the start, the racial hierarchies that fuel systemic racism might never have solidified. The cultural implications are just as staggering. Jazz, hip-hop, literature, fashion, these aren't just art forms, they're cultural revolutions. Now imagine those revolutions being fueled by even greater access to resources and opportunities. Black culture, already a global force, could have been an unstoppable driver of innovation, not just in America but worldwide. Reparations wouldn't have just been about money. They would have been about dignity, opportunity, and breaking cycles of oppression before they even began. It's a vision of what could have been, and what might still be possible in the future. Asterisk. Let's take a moment to zoom out and think about the long-term effects on the entire country. If reparations had been implemented in 1865, the shape of American society would be dramatically different today. First off, the political landscape. Imagine millions of African Americans with land, wealth, and educational access. They wouldn't just be passive members of society, they would be powerful voters, entrepreneurs, and leaders. Instead of being disenfranchised and marginalized, Black Americans could have had the power to influence policies from the very beginning. We could have seen a political environment much more reflective of America's diverse population. Instead of systemic exclusion, Black leaders would have been sitting at the table, shaping the laws, policies, and social systems that affected everyone. The trajectory of movements like the Civil Rights Movement might have shifted. There could have been more proactive change rather than a need for protests, sit-ins, and struggles that we saw in the 20th century. Think about the legal system, too. With economic and political power in place, African Americans would have had the financial means to fight legal battles, dismantle discriminatory laws, and challenge unconstitutional practices. Imagine a nation where Black lawyers, judges, and lawmakers shape the legal landscape alongside their white counterparts. The impact on the judicial system would be unimaginable. Now let's talk about something that might seem less obvious, but just as crucial: national unity. Today, the racial divide in America is deep, and the racial wealth gap is a major factor in that. But what if, from the start, there was an equitable distribution of wealth and land? How much sooner could we have reached a true sense of unity, not just in theory, but in practice? If the foundation of the American economy had been built on equality, it could have led to a society that was more cooperative, more united, and more forward-thinking. In a world where reparations were paid in 1865, not only would the landscape for Black Americans look entirely different, but the entire American experience would be reshaped. More innovation, more unity, more success. And most importantly, a greater sense of justice and fairness. It's an ideal that's not just about looking back, it's about what we can still strive toward today. Asterisk. Alright, now let's talk about the million-dollar question. Could reparations still happen? Is it too late, or is there still a path forward for America to make amends for its history? It's undeniable that the system we have today is built on centuries of inequality, but what we have to realize is that change is still possible. While we can't undo what happened in 1865, we can begin to correct the injustices of the past. The conversation about reparations is far from over. In recent years, we've seen a resurgence in discussions about reparations. Cities like Evanston, Illinois, have already taken steps by providing reparations in the form of housing assistance to Black residents. And on a national scale, the conversation has gained more traction, with politicians and activists pushing for policies that would address the generational impact of slavery and systemic racism. But here's the thing: reparations aren't just about handing out checks. It's about systemic changes that redistribute wealth, provide access to education, healthcare, housing, and opportunities to build long-term wealth. It's about ensuring that the broken promise of 1865 doesn't continue to haunt future generations. What could that look like? Well, imagine if the US government invested heavily in black communities, not just in a symbolic way, but with real, tangible support that addresses the wealth gap. Investments in businesses, schools, healthcare, and infrastructure could empower entire communities to thrive. Could we see land grants like those originally promised? It's possible. While the country isn't likely to hand out millions of acres of land to descendants of enslaved people, there are other ways to close the gap. Land trusts, affordable housing initiatives, and investments in black-owned businesses could act as modern-day reparations, helping to break the cycle of poverty. And of course, this is a conversation that's going to take time. True reparations require a shift in the collective mindset. It's about recognizing that the wealth and power that built America was built on the backs of black people, and in order to truly move forward, we must rectify those wrongs. But here's the thing, this is not an impossible task. History has shown that change can happen. Just look at how far the civil rights movement came in a few short decades. We're living in a time where the conversation around reparations is not just a distant dream, but a real possibility. It's up to us to keep pushing for change and keep the momentum going. So while we may never know exactly what America would look like if reparations had been paid in 1865, we do know that the future is still in our hands. If we keep fighting for equity, fairness, and justice, we can still create a world where reparations aren't just a question of what if, but a question of when. So, after everything we've discussed, I want you to take a moment and think about this. What would the world look like if reparations were paid in 1865? Would America be a different place today? Could the history of black Americans have been rewritten for the better? I hope this video has given you a lot to think about, and maybe even challenged the way you see our history and where we're headed. This what-if scenario isn't just some thought experiment. It's a wake-up call. It shows us that the decisions made in the past shape the future, and that real, meaningful change is always possible. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think reparations are still possible today? And if they were, how would they change the fabric of American society? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's get a conversation going. And if you're as passionate about this conversation as I am, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button if you're new here. We've only scratched the surface of these tough, important discussions, and I'll be diving even deeper into topics like this one in future videos. If you want